Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we poke into the big government, small government dichotomy. In the second half of our show, David Boaz, Executive Vice President at the Cato Institute, talks about the libertarian mind and the evolving political scene that seems to be slowly welcoming libertarians back from the wilderness. Up first, Daniel DiSalvo, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and Assistant Professor of Political Science at City College, is with us to examine some of the issues he raises in his new book, Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences. Dan, welcome to the show.
My pleasure to be here.
Dan, you opened your book with a couple of interesting quotes, and I'd like to give you an opportunity to share those and ask you why you use them.
Well, I picked two quotes, one from Franklin Roosevelt, another from the famous AFL-CIO labor leader, George Meany. The one from Roosevelt is, "The process of collective bargaining, as usually understood, cannot be transplanted into the public service." And the quick quote from Meany is, "It's impossible to bargain collectively with the government."
Why'd you lead with these?
I led with these in part to indicate that, views of collective bargaining and unionization of government workers have really changed dramatically. That is, really up until the 1960s and 70s, public employees were a very small percentage of the labor movement. Collective bargaining rights were very limited. And people on the left of the political spectrum, classically Roosevelt, was very much opposed to transporting the private sector unionization model into government, even though Roosevelt himself was a great champion of organized labor. He signed the Wagner Act.
Well, they understood the hazards.
And in that sense, Roosevelt really saw government as a different type of employer, and therefore he saw some of the hazards. Meany's statement is more just a statement of fact of when he was making the statement was pretty much across the country all the way up until the end of the 1950s and 1960s. It was, in most places, impossible, illegally not allowed to collectively bargain with the government, and there was a sort of across the political spectrum opposition to doing this. Now, obviously, that changed beginning in 1959 and then up through the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
And what has the consequence been on the public fisc?
Well, I think that's one of the big themes of the book, is to start out as just sort of the main claim or argument of the book is that by allowing collective bargaining and unionization of public employees, what you end up doing is creating a very powerful interest group that has negative consequences for, in the kind of wooden language of political science, the state's capacity, the capacity of government to do things. And it weakens government's capacity to do things by driving up costs and driving down productivity.
That's a real interesting theme I want to dive into. But first, maybe look at some of the numbers. You state in your book that the best current estimates of the unfunded pension liability for state and local government is around $3.2 trillion, about 21% of the total U.S. gross domestic product. Experts have been warning about this for ages. Why should anyone care now?
Good question. I think the issue here is that this is a kind of untold story, which is we think about big fiscal problems on the horizon. People think about Social Security. They think about Medicare. But frankly, in terms of the size of the outstanding liabilities, which are for the pension liabilities in state and local government, they are probably number 3 on that list of threats to the fiscal health of the whole United States.
And there are trade-offs involved.
There's big trade-offs. As over the last 2 decades, as the amount that governments must contribute to pension funds grows and contribute to paying for health care for retired public employees, that's really what I argue has begun to crowd out what government has money left over to spend on other things. So if you believe in government, that it can be active, that it can do things, it can provide goods and services, it can reduce inequalities, uplift the middle class, this is a big threat to government's ability to do that.
Oddly enough, it's a threat to the liberal agenda.
It's a threat to, in a sense, the whole Democratic agenda. And I think that has played out politically in the sense of dividing the Democratic Party over this issue. Take Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island. The entire thing that brought her into the political sphere, or to launch a political career, was she saw how the pension liabilities of Rhode Island were squeezing library hours, were reducing bus service in Providence, services on which the middle class and the lower middle class rely. And she said, well, this can't continue. I don't want to see government unable to provide library and bus services. And that's why she got into politics.
Well, it's funny. You talk about Providence. My sister's a teacher. Her husband is a college professor. They're looking ahead toward retirement. The kids are out of college, and they're selling their house and downsizing. They'd love to move into Providence. Beautiful little condos there. They're afraid. They're afraid to move to Rhode Island because they don't know what's coming with the fiscal burden and the possibility of having their taxes jacked up.
And that's a story that's being played out in other places as well. Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, has put his finger on exactly this same point. Unless there's a major pension reform in Illinois, Chicago, even if it doubled the property taxes in the city, could not cover its pension payment. And of course, with that threat on the horizon, what business would want to establish themselves in downtown Chicago?
Well, people can vote with their feet. That's one thing that is different than a federal debt. If you are in a state or a city whose fisc is collapsing, like Detroit, you pack up and go.
Yeah, and Detroit is obviously in some sense the canary in the coal mine for all of these issues about pensions, about ineffective state service and local services. And if you look at migratory patterns, you can see that states like New York lost on net in the first decade of the 21st century about 1 million people moving out of the state. So in that sense, you can see that that's going to just create bigger problems because it's undermining the tax base that you need to fund these large legacy costs.
Well, especially if the solution to the problem is let's just raise taxes.
I think that the costs we've incurred for paying both public employee salaries and especially paying their pensions and healthcare and retirement, because a lot of public employee compensation is backloaded into retirement, is really going to test the robustness of the tax base in many states and cities.
Public sector union support has become the backbone of the Democratic Party, not just through campaign contributions, but through get-out-the-vote efforts on Election Day. Why do you call this a poisoned chalice?
Well, I think that for Democrats today, the whole issue of public employee unions, public sector labor relations has really become something that divides the Democratic Party. So we see people like Gina Raimondo in Rhode Island, Rahm Emanuel, even Governor Cuomo in New York staking out positions that their erstwhile allies absolutely loathe. On the other side, we find people like Bill de Blasio here in New York City, Ras Baraka in Newark, who are much more favorable to the public employee union agenda. And that's because what's ended up happening is there's a kind of tension that's come out, or that public employee unionization and activist government so often tend to work at cross purposes. So in that sense, people are trying to have unionization, and that's leading to the Democrats relying on public employee unions and their members for money and manpower. And public employee unions are easily honeycombed into the Democratic Party apparatus. I'll give you an example. Here in New York, the United Federation of Teachers of New York City, one of its in-kind contributions to the New York State Senate Democratic campaign is to give them office space right next to their headquarters in Lower Manhattan. So that means, of course, if you're anyone involved in the Democratic Party campaign apparatus and you want to get the teachers union's view of things, and in fact some of the staff in these things
just open the door of your office and stick your head in the hall.
Stick your head in the hall. And often these things are interchangeable. People really cut their teeth organizing for the union and then go work in Democratic Party politics and so on.
Well, I also understand there was a fella on the union payroll who was the Albany state legislator actuary who scored all the bills in terms of pension reforms. Some fellow named Jonathan Schwartz, you had written about him?
Yeah, so he's a pension actuary who basically scored doing the accounting terms for any proposed changes to the pension schemes, and he would always push it so that it seemed like it would have the least effective cost.
Yeah, it looks good. Right.
It looks good. It's not going to cost the government very much money down the line. It's not going to increase our liabilities. And then it was discovered that he was on the payroll of many public employee unions when he asked which ones, and he says, which ones aren't I on the payroll of?
This is business as usual in Albany.
Then that's business as usual in Albany.
So, Dan, Sheldon Silver, the recently indicted New York State Assembly Speaker, has long declared himself to be the best friend of public unions. He's got some excitement right now, as you can see from the news. How deep does the back-scratching and corruption go in our various state governments?
Well, it varies a lot across state governments, but I'll give you an example here in New York. Silver did once promise at a teachers union rally to be the union's best friend in Albany. And in that sense, I think his fall from grace here with the federal corruption charges means the unions are going to be seeking a new ally. They need to have their third man in the room.
Man, yeah.
And in that sense, Governor Cuomo has taken the initiative to propose an education agenda that the teachers' unions despise. They've already spent a couple $100,000 in advance of the governor's State of the State address a couple of weeks ago, denouncing his plans to make it easier to dismiss poor-performing teachers, to raise or eliminate the cap on charter schools. And in that sense, the teachers' unions and the governor are set up for a historic battle, but they don't have their sort of main general.
So the teachers' union is, of course, very powerful in places like New York and Illinois. What role does forced union membership play in empowering public sector unions, and how does the process work?
This gets a little technical, so I hope your listeners will bear with us. Basically, when people speak of forced unionism, what they mean is what's called an agency shop, which means if you take a job in a unionized workplace, you can't be forced, according to constitutional law, as decided by the Supreme Court, to join a union. You can't be forced to be a union member. That would violate your First Amendment rights. However, the Supreme Court in this case said, well, you can be forced to pay representation fees to the union, which come out to be almost identical to union dues.
And that also goes into their political donation kitty, doesn't it?
It does, and in many cases, let's say here in New York, and because I'm a public university professor, I have direct experience with this. If you don't want to join the union, you then have to remember, so the default option is you pay representation fees that are nearly identical to union dues. And if you want any of that money back, if you disagree with the political spending of the union, you can exercise your Hudson rights. You have to write a letter, and then the union tells you what percentage of your dues
you might be able to get back.
You might be able to get back at, let's say you're paying about $1,200 a year in dues. If you do that here in New York State, you'll get back maybe $140.
Yeah, who needs the aggravation? How is it different in right-to-work states?
In right-to-work states, basically what a right-to-work means is that you are not allowed to charge fair share or agency fees, which of course means that if you don't want to pay into union coffers at all, you don't have to. And that means that many people don't, and they don't join the union, and the union's both membership and money tends to be lower in those states.
When states switch from an agency fee regime to a right-to-work regime, what happens to union membership?
We're seeing this play out today in Michigan and in Indiana, which are some of the most recent states to become right-to-work states. And what you see is that some workers decide that they're not getting the bang for their buck in what they're paying in union dues, and they decide to disassociate themselves from the union, so membership tends to fall, and they stop paying the agency fees or dues, and the union's revenue tends to go down as well.
Which means less money in the pockets of politicians.
Which can mean less money in the pockets of politicians, and it, in a sense, makes the unions, the public employee unions, more like regular interest groups that actually have to go out and get people to be motivated and interested in the cause and give money to them. So in that sense, it's more like the Sierra Club.
It levels the playing field.
It's much more equitable, yes.
There's often been a lot of sympathy for industrial labor unions in their history in America, particularly with the struggles to improve factory conditions and get pay for sometimes hazardous work. How has this been translated into the public sector union area, and what differences remain today between public and private sector unions?
This, in my view, is an essential question because many people have often looked at organized labor as all of one piece. They're all unions, they're all workers.
They wear the union label.
And they all wear the union label. And what I try to show in the book is that there are really big differences between public and private sector unions. They may be sort of the same genus, but they're really different species of organizations. So I'll give you a couple reasons for those differences. One is they have really different histories. Private sector unions really took off in the 30s and the New Deal hit their high point in the 60s and really have been declining ever since. And we have a ton of scholarship tracking that arc.
Well, they came in to solve some very real problems and then went on to destroy a lot of the industries that they took over. It was an interesting cycle.
That's right. And most scholarship by political scientists, economists, labor historians focuses on that arc because there's this David and Goliath story, which is, kind of humble workers fighting capitalist barons. There's much less work on public sector unions because there isn't really that same kind of...
There's no capitalist baron. There's the taxpayer.
Exactly. And the workers involved are not sort of industrial workers that are sort of beefy guys in hard hats and steel-toed boots. This is, more a story about female teachers with master's degrees. So it just doesn't have quite the same dynamic.
Cachet.
And in that sense, so you see this historical trends are different. Public employee unions are also governed not by federal law, but by state laws. So in a sense, the legal regimes governing the two types of unions are different.
Well, perhaps the biggest thing, though, is that rapacious private sector unions end up putting their victims out of business. Governments can't go out of business, or at least not until recently.
So that's another big difference, which is the presence, or in the case of the public sector, absence of market forces. So where unionism works well in the private sector is where the union is attentive to...
Yeah, they figure it out.
They say, look, we've got to have, and you can see this playing out today in divisions inside the labor movement. Many private sector unions, say construction unions, have actually sided with Republicans, even including Scott Walker. Why? Because they
want jobs.
They want jobs. They want the economy to grow. They want the government fisc to be healthy. And that's put them at odds with their public sector allies.
Yeah.
So you can see that absence of market forces is really important. And I think another essential difference is public sector unions get what I call 2 bites at the apple, meaning they can win things directly for their membership through collective bargaining and that failing through lobbying and electioneering, through politics. Whereas private sector unions, if they're going to win things directly for their membership...
They got one shot.
They got one shot, collective bargaining. Sure, they're engaged in politics, but that's about a broader agenda. And the last really big and important difference is public sector unions can exercise influence through the political process on both sides of the bargaining table.
Right, they bargain with themselves.
In that sense, I'll give you an example. John Corzine in 2006 was running for governor, and he was speaking to a rally of about 10,000 public employees, and he said he got excited, and he got up at the podium. He said, "We're going to fight for a fair contract."
Yeah, right.
Which, in that sense, Corzine, if he was elected governor, which he was, he would be management, not labor. So that ability to be, even if it's only a small amount of influence on both sides to influence management, that's different. Private sector unions, if you're the machinists union at Boeing, you have no say over the CEO of who Boeing is.
Let's move to the poster child of direct democracy and talk a little bit about California and public sector unionism in California. What's going on out there?
Well, I have a whole chapter in the book looking at the role of public employee unions in the direct democracy, the initiative process in California over the last 30 years. So I tally up, what's their win and loss record? And I look across the board at, say, what I find is that public employee unions in California are very effective at blocking any initiative that they oppose, and they're occasionally quite successful at winning big things. I'll give you one example. The California Teachers Association backed an initiative that requires the state government to spend 40% of its general revenue budget each year on education.
Right.
I mean, it's remarkable. One interest group is going to commandeer 40% of a state's budget for its issue. And that's in a state that's 12% of the total U.S. population. So everything that's big is big in California.
Well, if you look at the 3 major pension funds out there, CalPERS, CalSTRS, and UCRS, I think they cover something like 2.5 million workers. Their unfunded liabilities are over $500 billion. This is one state?
This is one state. So when you say everything's bigger, it's bigger in California. And one of the very ill-advised pension, don't want to dignify it by calling it reform, was in the 1990s when really even the New York Times had said the board of CalPERS was wearing the union label, and everyone said we can make the pensions much more generous without, it's not going to affect
It's going to be free.
It's going to be fine. Everything, the stock market has continued to boom as it has, and there's nothing to worry about.
What's this done to California bond ratings?
Well, they've plummeted. They're down there with Illinois, which has some of the lowest bond ratings. And that's another thing that if you look at states where unions are particularly strong, collective bargaining rights are extensive, those states tend to have worse bond ratings and higher levels of debt. So the only ones who are really profiting from those things are bankers.
Bankers profit no matter what.
That
seems to be how they break the system.
Right. But when you're paying greater interest on your debt, that's, again, when we think about this idea of crowding out, that's more money that's going to pay interest payments than could be used for something else.
So who's going to be driven bankrupt by the unions first, California or Illinois?
Well, I think we're probably less likely to see, spectacular bankruptcies. Everyone always wants to know about, but I think we're going to see is
Stockton or Detroit
or Vallejo, California, or San Bernardino. We'll continue to probably see some municipal bankruptcies here and there, but I think what the longer issue or the more pressing issue, it's not quite as spectacular, is the ongoing fiscal stress that states and cities are going to be under as they try to deal with the big promises that they've made in terms of compensation to public employees.
So we're spending all this money on our public workers. Are we getting our money's worth?
Probably not. What I find is that we're paying more for either the same level of service or potentially inferior service. Why? Because public employee unions negotiate work rules, and those work rules can have the effect of emasculating management. I'll give you an example. In California, the powerful Corrections Guard Officers Union negotiated a work rule by which prison guard wardens could not assign corrections officers to duties. Right? Oh. If your job is to manage, you'd think, well, I've got guard Joe here. Right. He's getting a little older. Maybe he's not as strong as he used to be. Maybe he shouldn't be patrolling the toughest cell blocks. But instead, the work rule stipulated that corrections officers could sign up for duty based on seniority. So if Joe wanted hazard pay and wanted to patrol that really tough cell block, he could.
Well, it's good if he wants to spike his pension, add up those fees in the out years. I understand California prison guards now earn about twice as much as prison guards in other states.
That's right. And they even lobbied for changing the laws of California to what was called 3 strikes, which would have the effect of inflating the number of people going to prison. You need more prisoners equals more prison guards equals more power for the union.
They've gone from 25,000 prisoners to 170,000 prisoners in California.
Which is a genuine crisis.
So, Dan, you've painted a rather dire picture. We're watching Greece implode before our eyes under the burden of its public sector unions, among other things. What's the best way for us to avoid the same fate?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a number of states beginning to take action. So one scenario going forward will be that we'll see more states move in a right-to-work direction, as Michigan and Indiana have recently done. And then those kinds of bills are being considered today in Maine and New Mexico and a few other states. So one future is slow but incremental reform that weakens the political power of public sector unions and makes them more synonymous.
State by state. That still leaves some states in great danger.
And it still leaves some of our biggest states in great danger because California, New York, the political alignments are such that they're not going to take that kind of action. Another possible future would be a very sweeping change, which would probably come from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has laid out a kind of logic for public employee collective bargaining in 2 recent cases, the majority opinion in both written by Justice Alito, one called Knox versus SEIU, the other called Harris versus Quinn, and there's a case percolating in California called Fredericks versus California Teacher Association, which may make it to the Supreme Court. And if Alito could assemble a coalition of the willing, so to speak, to take his logic laid out in those other cases to its fullest extent, it would in effect declare a right-to-work law for the public sector nationally, because the argument is that agency fees are violations of the First Amendment.
And that would break the fever. Dan, it's been both frightening and interesting to read your book and have you on the show. Thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
That was Daniel DiSalvo, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of Government Against Itself, Public Union Power and Its Consequences, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Check us out on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearPolitics.com, one of America's top political websites. Ahead, David Boaz from the Cato Institute brings us up to date on libertarians' return from the political wilderness. Stay tuned.